what we're going to see today is this, that Jesus is the greatest, and he's inviting us to the least, and to the least of these. And what he is going to do is he is going to introduce a conversation that maybe for us isn't shocking, but for his disciples, they would have had to rethink what they were doing and why they were doing it and what Jesus is doing and who he says he is in light of that. We're in a series called Who Do You Say I Am? In Luke 9, we see this passage, interaction between Jesus and his closest followers, his disciples. We see in Luke 9, verses 18 and 20, this is a simple passage. This is what it says, though. Once, when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowds say I am?" Right, at this point, Jesus' ministry has become what I would say famous or popular. And so people are following him. Jesus is like, "Who do the crowds say I am?" Well, the disciples said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others that one of the prophets long ago has come back to life. "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" And Peter, who I love, bold Peter, says, "You're God's Messiah." Here's what's interesting. I think Jesus, he doesn't ask this just offhand. I don't think Luke wrote this just because it was some filler passage. I think there's a lot of meat to this passage in 2 short verses. I think what Jesus is trying to get to is this, is what does your life say about me? What does your life say you believe about me, and how does that interact with your day-to-day? Not just what do you think about me, not just do you believe me, not just do you believe in the things that I am doing, the miracles and the wonders, but what do you say about me? He is defining the relationship of sorts. In the first week, I said this. We didn't go very far the first week. All I said was, would you consider what your life says about what you believe about Jesus? What does your life say about Jesus? And in this entire series, that's my hope, is that if you leave with nothing else, that maybe just for a minute each week or a minute each day, that you would stop and say, how does my life reflect Jesus? And what does it say that I believe about Jesus? What does it mean to follow Jesus in light of that? Because in this series, we're asking that question in tandem to looking at who does Jesus say he is? Who does he say he is, and how does he interact with people and create an understanding of what he has come to do and who he is in light of that? And so today, we're going to continue in Luke 9, and we're going to look at this. Jesus is the greatest who invites us to the least. That's what we're going to look at today. And we're going to look at it in Luke 9. So we have already been in Luke 9. We started there the first week looking at this passage that kind of set up the series. Last week, Ethan was in Luke 9, did a fabulous job walking us through that passage and just kind of looking at what does it mean to follow Jesus and understand dying to ourselves inside of that, right? And today I want to continue with another fairly short passage that kind of bounces around uniquely. But let's go from where Ethan was, okay, in Luke 9 and in 27 and beyond to where we're going to be. Here's what happens after last week's passage. Jesus ends up taking his 3 disciples, his kind of closest 3 disciples. He has 12. He takes the closest 3, Peter, James, and John, and he takes them up on a mountainside to pray. And here's what happens. As he's praying on the mountainside, all of a sudden, the glory of Jesus is visible to these 3 disciples. And all of a sudden, they can not only see Jesus for the fullness of who he is and his glory, but they also see Moses, okay, Moses from the Old Testament, not like Moses, the guy that just walked up the mountainside with them, right? Moses from the Old Testament and Elijah the prophet standing there with Jesus, and they're talking. Do you know the image that comes to mind? Do you guys remember watching the Star Wars movie? And that the 6th one where like all of a sudden Luke's there and then they have like Yoda and they have all that stuff, right? That's what it kind of like reminds me of a little bit. It's like Jesus and these 2 really awesome biblical characters, right? They're standing there and all of a sudden Jesus is talking to them. It says the fullness of Jesus' glory, right? The transfiguration of Jesus' glory is seen, and all of a sudden the three disciples that are can't help but just fall to their knees. They can't help but just be in awe of the glory of who Jesus is. Kind of compare it, if you think about going from a FaceTime experience to face-to-face. That maybe if we just, in a very poor illustration way, they had seen him in a FaceTime kind of experience. They'd been walking with him. They've been hearing from him. They've seen the miracles. They've seen the wonders, but they saw him at this level. And then all of a sudden, he reveals who he is, God in the flesh, and they are standing face to face with the God of the universe. They can't help but be in all of that. And they ask Jesus, they're like, do you want us to build a tabernacle? Do you want us to do something? Like, tell us what to do with this, right? It's almost a shocking experience for them. And Jesus, right, lets them in on that. So those three have that experience. Moses and Elijah, right, they disappear again. Jesus, he comes down the mountain with them. And as they're coming down the mountain after that experience, talk about two polar opposite experiences, they're met with a crowd who, to say the least, is not very happy. Crowd that's anticipating Jesus coming and wanting him to continue to do more of what he's doing. And all of a sudden, this dad breaks through the crowd. This dad breaks through the crowd, and he has a son who is demon-possessed. The son who's demon-possessed, and this demon is making this kid do kind of physical things that are hurting him and creating pain, and there's just a lot going on in this scene. And the dad comes up to Jesus and says, your disciples couldn't heal my boy. And all of a sudden, there's some tension. You go from this wonderful moment up on the mountainside to a very literal valley, and people are wondering what in the world's going on, Jesus. And Jesus, probably for some of us, this would be a shocking response, but kind of calls out the people in that crowd. Says, you perverse generation, why won't you believe? He's calling out their faith. He's calling out their heart a little bit. And then with his grace, heals the boy. And all of a sudden, inside of this scene, we get our passage. And our passage comes right after Jesus heals this boy. His disciples couldn't, calls out the generation, the crowd's unbelief. He continues by healing this boy, and then all of a sudden, Luke 9, verse 43 to 45 pop onto the scene. This is where we're going to be for the rest of our time. While everyone was marveling at all that Jesus did, he said to his disciples, listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Okay? The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. But they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them. So they did not grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. Right? If you see this scene play out, that for me was a very shocking next passage. Like, Luke, you missed something here. What's going on, right? What's happening? Or maybe even Jesus, why are we going there? The crowd is marveling, right? The crowd is amazed by what Jesus is doing, rightfully so. They're there and they're wondering about who is this guy, and then all of a sudden he's healing this boy who is demon-possessed, and now he's mentally stable and physically not hurting himself. There's something amazing to be seen by this guy, and we've heard stories for some. For some, they've seen stuff already. They're marveling at the wonders of who Jesus is and what he is doing, most importantly. And they want him to continue to do those things. And let's be honest. Let's just be flat out honest. If you were there, most likely that would be your response. I know it would be for me. Here's how my mind works. If I was standing there, put yourself in that seat. You're with the crowd. The dad barges through. Jesus kind of calls out the situation, then graciously heals this boy. I'd be sitting there marveling too, in first my response being, wow, That's a pretty epic scene. We read it and we're like, yep, it's kind of there. If you were to be there, you would lose your minds. You would lose your minds. You'd be like, what is happening right now? This kid who's lived in my town, who's been suffering from demon possession, who's hurt himself physically, who isn't mentally stable because of the demon possession. We just hear all of this horrific stuff going on in the home, and it's just awful, and now he's healed. And we don't have to worry about it anymore. The dad doesn't have to worry about it anymore. Then secondly, after that response, I would think, wow, what would it be like to have that power? Right? Could you just imagine, like, wow, what would it be like to be that great, to heal that boy? Because we all do that, right? The traditional icebreaker question is, if you were to be a superhero, what would be your superpower, right? We all wonder what it would be like to be great in some sort of fashion. We all wonder what it would look like to be a superhero on the screen, saving the day, doing the thing, making it happen. And so at one level, we're responding, wow, this is crazy, bonkers, awesome. And at another level, I bet some are wondering, where in the world is this guy from? And what in the world is going on? And maybe, just maybe, how do I become as great as he is? Because that's not normal. And Jesus, in the midst of all of that, turns to his disciples. He turns to his disciples as the crowd is marveling, which I understand completely. And probably as his disciples are semi-marveling, they've probably seen a number of things before, but they're still in shock because they couldn't do it themselves. And he says, listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. And all of a sudden, as I read this, I'm like, Jesus, why? Where are we going with this? This awesome thing just happened. Everybody's marveling. Everybody's excited. He healed this demon-possessed boy. He was on the mountainside. All this really neat stuff. And you're going to introduce this kind of conversation in this moment? That doesn't quite make sense. And yet I think Jesus was turning the disciples on their head. I think Jesus wanted to kind of reprioritize their hearts inside of this conversation. It's not on the screen, but it might be worth writing down. I think Jesus wants his disciples to know there's something more glorious to marvel at. I think Jesus wants them to know there's something more glorious and wonderful and all-striking to marvel at. Jesus is inviting his disciples to see beyond this miracle. Because here's the reality. This miracle of this demon-possessed boy is amazing. It is all-striking. It is beautiful. There is redemption. There is so many neat things that are happening in it. But here's the reality. The crowd is just going to leave it at that. They're going to marvel at this miracle and move on. And what Jesus wants them to know, even though what looks like a presentation of this kind of depressing, why'd he go there? There's something for them to long for and to see beyond this moment. And this moment is pointing to that. This is what a great leader does. You lead with vision. Where are we going? Where are we actually leaning into? And Jesus wants them to see that it's not just here that I'm healing this demon-possessed boy, but something greater to marvel at is that I'm going to rescue humanity from their sinfulness. Because here's the reality. What we see inside of this story of this demon-possessed boy correlates to you and I spiritually. That there's something inside of our hearts that is holding us captive. Something that you and I cannot break from in and of ourselves. That this boy was captive by a demon, and there's something inside of us that has captured us, and it's called sin. What tends to happen is this, that to use the picture of a courtroom, that each and every one of us enters into the courtroom every single day. And what happens is this, you can either be captured in one of two ways. You can either be captured in one way, which we'll talk about more of this in a little bit, with pride, a high self-esteem, that I'm going to try to do as much and accomplish as much as I can to try to break free of whatever has gotten me. And I go into the courtroom every day and I throw down the good things. I throw down what I did. I throw down the checklist and I try to come up with enough to get loose of it, to get free of it. For others of us, we're on the other ends. It's maybe not a high self-esteem of, look, I can do this and accomplish this myself. Maybe it's on the other end of the spectrum, where everybody's told me I'm junk, everybody's told me that I'm worthless. I have proven that by the way I've lived life and the things that I have done, and so it's not even worth trying anymore. And so my shame and my guilt and my fear have me handcuffed, and I literally have nothing to present. What is life even? And that might be an overgeneralization, but maybe you're in one of those two seats where you are captured by this thing and you're trying to get loose of it through yourself and in and of yourself and trying to figure it out yourself. And the reality is this, that what Jesus did for that little boy physically, he desires to do for all humanity spiritually. And Jesus tells us that he was given into the hands of men so that you and I could be given into the hand of God, our Father. That what Jesus is telling them here is there is good news that is coming. And the crowd is going to marvel at this and move on. But what he doesn't want his disciples to lose sight of is there's something greater. There's a greater vision to why I'm here, disciples. There's a kingdom that I am enforcing and leading into this earth that is going to give freedom and rescue and forgiveness to all of those who are captive to their sin and captive to what their pride is doing in their hearts, whether I can do this myself or I can't do this at all. And Jesus wants to introduce that to them, and he wants them to know this in every single moment that he is walking with them through. Because the good news of Jesus is he used his greatness to save us from our sinfulness. Jesus did not come down to this earth. You can read this in Philippians 2. He did not come down to this earth to show us how great and amazing the things that he can do are. He came down to use his greatness in and of himself to rescue us and save us. And through the great things that he did, he pointed us to that. Jesus wants you to know that he is the greatest, and he came into the least of these and saved us. That anyone who has sinned is in need of a Savior, which includes all of us. That Jesus took that first step of forgiveness. Jesus took that first step of redemption. Jesus took that first step of restoration. He took the punishment so you could take the freedom. He took the judgment so you could take the mercy. He took the cross so you could take life. And in his death and resurrection, we get to experience his grace and his mercy and his love and his invitation into relationship. Here's the reality. Our human nature is to try to come forward in and of myself and present to you all the things I've done as my verdict. And what Jesus is telling us is at the cross and through his resurrection, the verdict is done. It's finished. He says, I took your guilty status so you could take my non-guilty status. And the reality is this, he's inviting us to marvel at that. He's inviting us to marvel at something different than just really good, great things, but to marvel at who he is and what he has done for us at a spiritually deep level. So the question I would ask is this: are you marveling at the Messiah's good news? Are you marveling at the Messiah's good news? The fact that Peter responded and said, you're God's Messiah, You're the Savior. You're the one to come. Means that with him comes good news. And his good news is this, is that I don't have to perform anymore to try to make it. I don't have to try to come up with, in and of myself, anything to present. That what he did on the cross and through the resurrection is the verdict. And through that verdict, it leads to a performance that looks more and more like him. For some of us, we are marveling and marveling and marveling, but we're missing what to marvel at. We're missing the greatness of Jesus and what he has done in demonstrating to us his love and his grace through dying for us. The greatness of Jesus, he wants us to stare at, is the reality that he allowed us to wear that, and he took our place instead. And so here is my invitation to you. This is the question. I got 3 applications today. I got no fancy points. I just have 3 applications with very easy, hopefully easy onboarding for you. But the question I would ask, and then I'll give you the application, is this: how am I marveling at the greatness of Jesus who rescued me today? How am I marveling at the greatness of Jesus rescuing me today? Listen, we can marvel at really good things. We can marvel at even great things. We can marvel at all the neat things that Jesus did in his time here. We can marvel at how great the church is doing and what's happening there and what God's doing in and through people. But am I consciously, every single day, marveling at the good news of Jesus, which is the only thing that transforms me and releases me and frees me? And so my invitation is this: find 1 minute a day this week to marvel at the good news of Jesus. 1 minute. 1 minute, 7 minutes this week. That's all I'm asking. To just sit there in silence, reflecting upon what Jesus has done for you. We can sit and marvel at the really good things about Jesus, and wow, he did this, and wow, he did that, and look at this, and look at that. Wow, the church this and church that, and completely miss the gospel. We can come over here and we can marvel at all that the world has to offer and what's happening around us, and we can marvel at the good things and the bad things, and wow, and we can miss the good news of Jesus. And what Jesus wants us to know is this: that you every single day, if you are in Christ, you have the same verdict when you wake up. His mercy is new every morning. You wear a non-guilty shirt because he took the guiltiness on the cross. And the reality is this: if I stop marveling at that exchange, then I start to believe the lies, and I start to lose sight of Jesus, and I start to become inward instead of outward focused. And I start to lose sight of worshiping the greatness of who he is every single day. I was struck by this. I'm in a Bible plan that took me through Revelations here, the times, and I'm not going to get in the thick of all that, right? This is not the series for that. But I found it fascinating in just this short verse. He's calling to mind an angel that presented the good news in the heavenly realms. And this is what it says: then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. Jesus is for all, and his kingdom is about all. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and the springs of the water." Here's what I want you to see: that his good news, it prompts a response. When you marvel long enough, you will not be able to help fearing him, not in a, oh, I'm scared of him, but in a reverent, honorable way, and worshiping him. It says, worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of the water. The creator, the great one of the universe, is the one who took the stand for you so that you could wear his non-guilty, righteous status. That is something to be marveled at. And in this passage, I think Jesus is looking at his disciples and saying, don't miss it. Don't miss it. He wants them to know that the gospel, the good news of Jesus, is the reason that he is here. It's his kingdom on earth. And he is ushering that in, and it looks very different. And they were completely lost. Do you notice that? Now I actually feel for them. Because we have the benefit of the whole Bible, and we have the benefit of like Jesus and our parents telling us stories. Like that verse, right? It kind of clicks in mind what's going to happen. For them, they're like, what are you talking about, Jesus? What's going on? Why? We're confused. They're kind of fearful to even ask. They're like, what did he mean by that? This awesome thing just happened. Now what? And where are we going with that? And what's interesting is the next passage kind of speaks to it a little bit. This is where the next verses go in Luke 9. I want to turn that slide, 46 to 48. This is right after what we just read in Luke 9, 43 to 45. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Now, I'm not sure how close in proximity the first two verses are to these passage of verses, but they're in the same section. So I think they were around the same kind of conversation, whether it was minutes, seconds, maybe hours, days, I don't know, but it was in the context of the same conversation. And that's where they go. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. Then he said to them, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is least among you all who is the greatest. I think it's fascinating. The disciples, they're arguing. Right? Jesus just shares this profound miracle, and then he shares this profound kind of one-liner of what's going to happen. And the disciples, they just kind of jump into arguing about who's going to be the greatest. Like I said, I don't know the proximity of the conversation, but it's kind of humorous a little bit. They're confused about what Jesus said, so why don't we argue about who's going to be the greatest? And what they're getting at is this. A lot of his disciples and the Jewish people envisioned a Messiah coming who was victorious in battle, who was a soldier, a captain, someone who was going to fight the war against Rome for them, because Rome was oppressing them. And so they envisioned this person, this Messiah, coming on horseback with an Messiah, this new teacher who claims to be the Messiah, and then in their minds, the picture that they get is they're getting an army around them, and they're going to go and take over Rome. They're going to take back their place. And so they're kind of vying for who's going to be at the right and who's going to be at the left of Jesus. All right, let's be honest. You and I have done that before. Maybe not with Jesus, but we've done that before. With our parents, right? Who's the favorite sibling? I know who in our family it is, right? It's not me, right? At work, there's a natural tendency. There's a worldly tendency, a human nature tendency to vie for the position, for the posture, for the power, for the placement of greatness. There's something inside of us that drives to that. I think it's humorous that this is just the conversation that came after that. They're arguing about greatness and status and wanting to be in a place right next to Jesus in that. And here's where Jesus goes. I think he taps into something really quickly, and then he repositions their thinking. Because what greatness does is it often plays to pride. Greatness often plays to pride. Tim Keller has this fantastic, really short book. It's called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. It's like $3 or $4 on Amazon, okay? And it's 30 or 40 pages. It's a read you can do in 20 or 30 minutes. I would invite you to buy this and read it. It is one of the greatest books I've ever read and one of the shortest books I've ever read, right? But inside of this book, this is what Tim Keller says, the natural condition of the human ego, right? The ego sits inside of us, this human nature. The natural condition is an emptiness, a painfulness, a busyness, and a fragileness. It's empty, it's painful, it's busy, and it's fragile. Our natural condition is an emptiness because of our sin. And pride is a root of sin. And so inside of us, there is this emptiness, this void, this pain point, per se, that we are all trying to fill in and of ourselves. We're all trying to fill. And for some of us, it looks like what the disciples are doing. We're arguing about who's going to be the greatest. And we stack up all of our accomplishments against other people. Because what Tim Keller would say is this: pride, right? Pride is not just about being good or being better. It's about being the best. I'm better than everyone. I am at the best. It's something that plays into that. And so for some of us, right, the human natural ego is to lay down all our stuff and say, this is what I have to offer. And this is why I should be in the place, and why I should be in the seat, and why I should have the power, and why I should have the position. We can do that religiously and non-religiously, just so that we're all aware. You can do that following Jesus, like the disciples, or not following Jesus. For others of us, though, we may not be in that seat, and you might be in the seat of, I can never even achieve greatness. Because you've been told so many times that you aren't great, you're going to amount to nothing, this, that, and everything. And all of a sudden, you're trying to, in and of yourselves, find somewhere to believe in yourself, just trust in yourself. Because either way, whether it's my accomplishments or I'm trying to figure it out in and of myself, trying to fill myself up and find myself in that and define myself and platform myself where Jesus only can. But the interesting thing about trying to fill myself up in and of myself is it always just falls flat. I always just fill myself with air that has no foundation to it. I always fill myself and it's fragile, so when someone pokes it, it bursts. Because it's just little bits of meaninglessness. We try to fill ourselves up with whether work, position, family status, toys, money, whatever it may be. It doesn't work. What Jesus is getting at is there's something different when it comes to greatness. I think he redefines greatness for them. What I think is interesting is this. Jesus doesn't deny or dismiss it. I think sometimes we can be like, Jesus, he's like anti-greatness, right? We'd say anti-doing this or that, or anti-that. I don't think Jesus is anti-greatness. I think he wants to redefine it. What does it actually mean to be great inside the kingdom of heaven? Is it trying to fill myself up as much as I can so that I am better than everybody else and everybody else sees that? Or is it actually emptying myself for the least of these and becoming less so someone else can become more? And that's what Jesus introduces to them. He says it's not about how much you can fill yourself up with. It's not about how much good thoughts you can fill yourself up with or how much you can build your ego up with. It's actually how much you can get outside of yourself so that you can love another and serve another freely. Because once you're secure in knowing who you are, you will not worry about yourself moving forward. That's a lot easier said than done. I understand that. And I would challenge you, read the book. Tim Keller goes into great lengths and detail. Because here's the reality. Jesus came onto this earth and he used his greatness to rescue us out of our lostness and messiness. And that's the new standard of greatness. Jesus did not come to this earth and try to build his identity off of what other people thought. He knew exactly what the Father thought of him. This is my Son, whom I love and am well pleased. And Jesus lived out of the security and the freedom of that. And so when he is looking at his disciples, he wants them to connect their life first to the reality that he has done for them what they cannot do for themselves. And out of that, it will tell them to pursue something bigger and better and greater. Serving others without worrying about myself. Tim Keller would put it like this. You see, the verdict is in. using this courtroom language. And now I perform on the basis of the verdict of non-guilty, the verdict of you are righteous. Jesus took for you what you were supposed to take. Because he loves me and he accepts me, I do not have to do things just to build up my resume. I do not have to do things to make me look good. I can do things for the joy of doing them. I can help people to help people, not so I can feel better about myself and not so I can fill up my emptiness. Listen, here's the reality. Jesus was going much deeper than just hang out with these little children. There's something at a heart level that Jesus wanted them to see, that they were trying to fill themselves up within and of themselves, and it always fell flat. And in doing so, they very quickly saw that they were not hitting the mark. And maybe you've been in that seat before. We've tried and tried and tried, and you're presenting this verdict of your performance, and it's just never enough. It can be per the social status or per what society says. I'm putting that out, but it's always going to be a bar that keeps going higher. Could be based off of achievement purely. If I get the good grades, if I do the right things in sports, then I get to a certain point. Or it can just be, if I just figure out who I am and I just live truly to that, then I'll measure up. You'll always let yourself down too. The reality is this: Jesus presents us with a new way based on what he's done for us, not based on some moral standard to just perform by. But because I've saved you, you can live freely now in light of this. Jesus has done that for me. So the statement I would say is this: I can make myself less for the sake of making someone else more. And I love where Jesus goes with this. Jesus uses a child to illustrate this, right? They probably were sitting in a field or somewhere in the community, right? There's probably children playing around. And in that society, right, children would have been a second thought. Children would have been kind of off to the side. Children would have brought a lot of power and prestige because they can't give to anything, right? And Jesus says, when you welcome one of these, you welcome me. If you welcome me, you welcome my Father. Do for the least of these. What is he saying inside of that? He's saying, are you willing? Are you so secure in my relationship with you that you are willing to do to the least of these, even if it brings you no power, prestige, or platform? Am I able to become least to the least of these so that they get to experience who Jesus is? Jesus wasn't necessarily saying that the children, because they're the least of these, are the greatest. But what would it look like to use our greatness to serve others freely? So the question I would ask is this: how am I moving toward the least of these this week? How am I moving toward the least of these this week? Now listen. Our culture and our world is very in tune with serving those who are in the least of these categories or suffering. But a lot of times it is for my platforming, my identity, and my security. We have to base it in Jesus before we ever move into taking care of the least of these. So the question I would make sure to ask is, am I marveling at the good news of Jesus first? And then how am I moving into the least of these? And the action I would take is this, okay? So take 1 minute every day to marvel at the good news of Jesus. In this category, I would say this: find 1 moment to talk with your family about this. What if your family was on a mission to run into the least of these, not for some pat on the back, or we did it, or church accomplishment, or some sort of moral accomplishment to run into, so that we could position them differently? Maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's someone in the community. Maybe it's someone that irritates the snot out of you. Maybe it's a neighborhood family. There's a bunch of children that you can hang out with. Maybe don't get a lot of adult time. Maybe don't necessarily have a great situation at home. Maybe it's someone who's struggling financially. Maybe it's someone who is struggling and just society looks at them uniquely. They would be considered a least of these. Because Jesus did for us what we could not do for ourselves. And I would say we were in that category. We are in that category as sinners, the least of these. He's running into our lives through that. And as you do it, I would just ask this question. Is my initial thought, I am better than them, or I can be Jesus to them? My hope is my heart, and I'm not speaking for you guys, I'm speaking for me on this, is that my heart more consistently would ask the question, how can I be Jesus to them, rather than, am I better than them? Or how am I better than them? Jesus says, use this greatness, use this relationship with me, right? Greatness is, that's a hard word to use, but use this relationship with me for the betterment of someone else, not for the sake of power and prestige. Now, the passage doesn't end there, which I find just fascinating, just absolutely fascinating, because the disciples, I believe, still didn't get it. Because John comes to Jesus and he does this. Luke 9, 49, 50. Master, said John, we saw someone driving out demons in your name. So they're using the name of Jesus Christ. They were doing what the disciples have been given the power to do, right? They just weren't in the group. And we tried to stop him because he's not one of us, right? Jesus says this, do not stop him, for whoever is not against you is for you. The disciples were trying to stop this guy. And I think it's humorous, but isn't it so relatable? Isn't it so relatable? Even if you've been a follower of Christ, this is probably 2 verses that can be as relatable as ever. Where all of a sudden you're following Jesus, you're doing the thing, things are going well, and you see someone else doing it, well, they're doing it different than me. They're not in the same group as me. They don't do this over here like we do it. They don't do this over here like we do it, right? The disciples were like, Jesus, that person who was doing good in your name, but he wasn't in our group. He wasn't one of us, the 12. So we stopped him. They weren't quite figuring it out. And it's so easy to live life like that, where I can base my relationship with Jesus as the one and the thing that I have, and I'm going to do it the way that I'm going to do it, and it's the best way to do it. If anybody else does it differently, I'm not so sure. If anybody else isn't a part of this group or this circle, I'm not so sure. And pride can very quickly isolate me. I think I'm the only one who should do it or can do it. It's so easy to do this. And I love what Jesus does because I think he kind of tears this. He deals with the reality that we cannot save ourselves. And then he deals with the reality of what it looks like to actually serve outside of yourself to those that are in your community and around you. But here's the reality. He goes even deeper. And what he is trying to get at of pride. It can be very easy, even in this setting that feels safe and comfortable. It can be really easy to look around and even still try to maintain some sort of worldly greatness by how I do it, what I do, how it looks, what group I'm in, and how that plays out. That even for those on the same team, pride can isolate you. And Jesus is like, you've missed the point. The point is, with me, you do not have to think about yourself anymore. It's not thinking less than, it's not thinking more than, it's just thinking of myself less because I know who I am in Jesus. When I know who I am in Jesus, I don't have to worry about my salvation, and if I'm doing enough, he's done it for me. And I don't have to worry about is people watching me and who I'm hanging out with, because I get to just help people for the sake of helping people because I have been helped and saved, and I don't have to worry about trying to level myself up even inside of my own circles. I have to worry if I don't do it like them or if they do this better and I'm over here, because God wants us to be in this unique unity of us not worrying about ourselves anymore, but thinking about how we can move into people who don't know him. The reality is this: if I'm vying for my greatness all the time, I will lose sight of the greatest one. And when I lose sight of the greatest one, I start to fill myself up in and of myself, and that falls flat very quick. Now, this last one, here's the question I would say. How am I supporting those around me this week? The disciples, they stopped this guy. Like, no. You're not one of the 12. You don't know Jesus. You don't go to our church. You didn't say his name the way we say his name. You didn't do the little thing over here like we do the little thing. Don't. But what if Jesus' movement was less about stopping and more about supporting and moving the movement of the gospel into our community and beyond, coming around people and encouraging them, even if it feels different or it is different than how we would do it. This is what I would say: find one person who you can support to mobilize the gospel. Find one person who you can support to mobilize the gospel. When it becomes less about me and more about others, it becomes less about how great I am at it and more about how great I am at mobilizing others into it. That all of a sudden I see others not in getting in my way, but as a part of the way that I introduce people to Jesus. As the band comes up and we close, I think this entire passage, yet small, is very powerful. It's very powerful because it goes beyond you and I. And I struggle with a lot of the concepts that Jesus introduces in this passage. I have a tendency to fill myself up. I have a tendency to do for others out of a need for performance, out of a need to find myself, out of a need to try to climb the bar. And I can struggle with people that don't do it the same way I do it, aren't in the same circle that I'm in. What Jesus wants us to see is when he is at the center and he is the greatest in our life, all of a sudden I'm free of trying to define myself as great. I'm free even from being defined as identity, is my life, is my meaning, is my purpose, defined by anything outside of him. And when it's defined by him, I'm able to run into those who are at the least of these and share with them the greatness of him. And I'm able to do that with others in a loving way. What does your life say you believe about Jesus? Because I believe Jesus, the greatest, used his greatness for the least of these and invites me to do so also. Father, we thank you for who you are and all that you do. Thank you for loving us and leading us. Thank you for caring for us. Thank you for coming alongside of us. Thank you for using your greatness, your mercy, your grace, your holiness for the sake of my life and inviting me to do the same to others. Father, would you free us from thinking about ourselves all the time, and would you introduce to us a new reality of thinking about others freely? Would you introduce to us a new way of serving and loving? Would you introduce to us a new way of partnering with each other in that? It's not about us. We thank you for Jesus. We thank you that he did for us what we could not do for ourselves. So we give you this last song. We give you our afternoons to do with us as you please. And Father, would you lead us inside of this conversation? Pray this in your name.